Welcome to the Side Hustle Paradise Summit. I'm your host, Marc, Guberti, the podcasting coach, bringing you expert sessions from top side hustlers and business owners where we teach you how to boost your income and do the work that you love. And podcasting is one of my favorite ways to monetize, to build a business. And we have an awesome expert who's going to talk with us, how to start a podcast, different ways to monetize, to getting sponsors involved. And she's a really great person for this. Why? Because she has owned, operated, and sold several highly successful businesses. She's served as a business coach to hundreds of small business owners, and her agency, True Native Media, connects advertisers who want better results with podcasters who are looking for sponsors. So our expert who joins us for this session is none other than Heather Osgood. Heather, welcome to the summit.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Heather, I'm so happy to have you on Side Hustle Paradise, and I've already talked about podcasting. I keep talking about it to no end. So let's just get into the value that we can provide. So there's a lot of different ways to start a podcast. You can use something like Libsyn or Captivate or any podcast hosting, but there are some things you have to do regardless of which hosting you pick. So for people who aren't podcast savvy, what advice would you have for them for starting their own podcast successfully?
That's a great question. I think if you're interested in starting a podcast, the first thing that you need to do is really look at what value you can provide the world and your community. People are interested in listening to your podcast because you have something unique to say. So first and foremost, I think it's really important to make sure that you actually have something unique to contribute to the conversation. So start with that. Oftentimes, if you have no idea where to start, just record episodes. And these might not be episodes that you actually produce anywhere, but just by creating the episodes will help you find your voice and help you really get that message out that you feel like you can bring to the world. So make sure you have something that's valuable to say. And then next, I tell people to look around and see who else is doing something similar in the space. So if you're thinking about starting a weight loss podcast, look at all the other weight loss podcasts and see what they're doing. One thing that I see people do a lot is they'll name their podcast the same name as another podcast. So I encourage people to look through the podcasts that are out there and try to name your show something different that doesn't already exist, because that will help differentiate yourself. Of course, you'll need to get the equipment, which I'm sure you've talked to your audience about before. I won't go through that because I'm not an equipment specialist. And also there are lots and lots of YouTube videos and things out there to help you with that. But once you get your topic, once you get your title, cover art obviously is the next big step for you. As you mentioned, you have to select your hosting provider, which is really important. I don't think that people put enough emphasis on who they are selecting for their hosting provider. So I would recommend that you do your research, and I would recommend that as you're going through, you pick a podcast hosting provider that is IAB certified or IAB compliant. And then after you have all those pieces in place, the last thing to do is go ahead, record your episodes, make sure that you are recording a handful of episodes. So you don't usually want to release a podcast with just one episode, but multiple episodes, and then get going. Another bit of advice I like to give people is that if you have never started a podcast, I recommend that you start in seasons. So you don't need to start a weekly or a daily podcast and say, I'm starting this, I'm going to record this podcast for the rest of my life every day or every Wednesday. If you start in seasons, it gives you that opportunity to create 10 really great episodes. And then after you've created those 10 really great episodes, you can take a break, you can regroup, you can look at feedback you've gotten, and then you can produce season 2, which is another great batch of 10 terrific episodes. So those are my top tips for starting a podcast.
And those are really solid tips. I tell clients that you want to have a bunch of episodes in the queue already, because podcasting, I feel like a lot of people, they see it as very stressful. And it's stressful if you don't have any episodes in the queue, because you got to scramble to find the guest. Mm-hmm. You have to hope the guest shows, and technology is working for you. There's a lot of unknowns, but if you do have that queue in advance, It just makes the whole thing easier. And then just searching your title idea. I do this for all podcasts I think about. I just search the title. If something comes up with the same title, I have to come up with a different title because you don't want to get mixed up for a more established podcast. Now, one of the things that a lot of podcasters do is it's more of they treat it like a business, but it's really a hobby. So you could be putting in all the hours, but you have no money to show for it. What's your advice for podcast hosts who are looking to monetize their shows so that it becomes sustainable?
Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, I see that people think that they're treating their podcast like a business, but they are treating it more like a hobby. So I recommend that you get really serious with yourself and look at how committed you are to your podcast. If you're not producing your show on a regular basis, if you're not investing in the quality of the content, if you're not invested in growing your audience size, you're not invested in marketing your show, you really aren't actually running it like a business. I also recommend that you actually get a business license, run it like it is an actual business and it will be a business for you. So think about the podcast as your product. And then if that's your product, how are you promoting your product? How are you getting sales for your product? Those are very, very important pieces. I have found more often people think that they're running their podcast like a business, but in reality, it is a hobby. And when you have a full-time job and you're trying to start a side hustle, it's a lot of work, and that's regardless of what it is that you're creating. When you've already worked 40 or 50 hours, maybe you have a family, you've got all these commitments, trying to do something additional on top of that is it can be straining for you. And so make sure that you have time carved out in your week to really dedicate time to what it is that you're creating. And if you create it like a business, if you set it up like a business, you'll have a much better chance on the end of actually making money. Create a business plan. It doesn't have to be a 50-page business, just a one-page. How are you planning to monetize the podcast? How are you planning to monetize or market the podcast, grow audience size? And there are lots of different ways that you can monetize a podcast. But if you come into it as a business and approach it like a business, you'll have a greater chance of making money on the backside.
And Heather brings up a really great theme where it's about your mindset. You want to approach it like a business person. Like you don't want to approach podcasts and like, oh, let's see what this thing does for me. Let's see if it really thinking about the monetization and really thinking about like, how am I going to get sponsors for my show? How am I going to turn guests into clients or use my podcast to get more speaking stages? What is my monetization plan? And getting clear on that is going to help you go to the next level. And sponsors, I feel like, are that you do need downloads, you do need an audience to get those sponsors because, they pay for a result. But with sponsors, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to go about them. But I know you have your agency. So I'm wondering if you could share with us, how your agency fits into the grand scheme of helping podcasters and sponsors connect with each other.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So what we do is we're kind of the middlemen. So we represent podcasts and we connect them with advertisers. And we make sure that everything is going to run smoothly. So the way I look at it is that as a podcaster, you are a content creator. First and foremost, your job is to create great content. That's your passion most of the time. And oftentimes podcasters aren't necessarily equipped or educated on how best to come up with advertisers. So we help them do that. So instead of them having to put all of the work into figuring out how to get advertisers, we do that work for them. And then on the flip side, we work with advertisers to make sure that they're selecting the right podcast, that they have a really good campaign laid out so that they can get a return on their investment.
And it's really good how, Heather, you're like clearly what the podcaster wants, what kind of person the podcaster is, what kind of person the sponsor is, and how they're looking for results. Because knowing your avatar, and I know we're using this in the context of Heather's agency, but knowing your avatar is one of those very important things for growing as a podcaster. It's like knowing who your listener is and creating content for them, or knowing who your client is and attracting that kind of presence on your show. So I'm wondering if you could share with us, like, how can we get clear on what type of listener is the best fit for our show?
The types of listeners that you are going to attract are the listeners that are interested in the content that you're creating. And that might sound like, duh, of course, that, that's who's going to be listening. But you have to think about the content and then think about how it's going to benefit the end user. So if you're creating an automotive podcast and you're talking about cars and how great they are and the latest models that are coming out, that's going to create and attract a very different audience for you than if you are a mom podcast and you're talking about how to entertain your children at home. So think about the content you're creating. I encourage people to really try to cultivate a specific audience, especially if advertisers are important to you. If someone comes to me and I say, who listens to your podcast? And they say, everybody listens to my podcast. That isn't very helpful for me because everybody doesn't purchase all products. And when I'm going out to sell an advertiser, I need to sell the advertiser on a very specific target demographic. They need to know that they're reaching a middle-aged woman that has a certain income, that stays at home or is employed, or, I'm wanting to reach a very specific person for that advertiser. And if your podcast reaches everybody, then in essence, sometimes it reaches nobody because it's not reaching a big enough group of people. The other reality is that there is an audience that your content is going to resonate with. I find it interesting because I have been told often by podcasters that they'll say, gosh, this type of person listens to my show, and that's not who I expected. And sometimes when you're creating content, you might not be 100% sure who that content is going to resonate with until you create it, until it's out there in the world. So if you find yourself in that situation where you've got a real passion for the content you want to create, but you're not sure who your avatar is going to be, I recommend that you create the content, you put a lot of effort into it, you make that podcast for a person. I think one of the mistakes that podcasters make is that they act like they're talking to this huge audience. Podcasting is a very intimate medium, and realistically, we're speaking to one person, right? One person is watching this video right now, getting information about how we can help that one person. Is not the idea of speaking to a huge crowd. So when you're making content, think about who you're speaking to and try to speak to that person. And then once you get your show up and running, I oftentimes encourage my podcasters to do a survey of their audience. That's the best way for you to find out who is listening to your show, is by doing a survey and finding out who is actually listening. Then you can take that information in and say, gosh, I would have thought that it would have been more like X, Y, and Z, but it turns out it's this person. And through that survey, if you can get clear on the types of information that person is wanting more of, then that can help be a good jumping off point for you to create future content.
And Heather brings up a lot of great points there. Think about the age of your listener, thinking about demographics, thinking about, just really basic in the sense that, these are people who enjoy your content. And you're just painting that better picture of the person, and realize that you're just talking to one person with your content. I mean, even if you get hundreds of downloads or thousands of downloads, it's one person who's listening. It's not like all 1,000 people gathered in the same room like a conference. So you do have to engage with people in that way to create that better experience.
Absolutely.
So I know you have your agency that connects podcasts and sponsors, which we will definitely be including down below as a link. But would you say there's any other places that you want us to go to follow your work and journey?
I post a lot on LinkedIn. So if you're interested in learning more about how I approach podcasts or podcast advertising, you can find me on LinkedIn.
We'll have the LinkedIn down below as well. Heather, thank you so much for joining us on Side Hustle Paradise. It was such a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great. And I hope that this information will be helpful to your audience.